Hello everyone and welcome. Find a comfortable spot, perhaps with a cup of tea, and settle in. Today, we are not just visiting the past, we are stepping into it, carefully and quietly, to understand a world of profound beauty and equally profound danger. Silence in this world was a language of its own. What was not said was often more important than what was. A pause, a held breath, a moment of stillness. These were the spaces where fortunes were won and lost. The adoption of children was a common practice, especially within the samurai class, as a way to ensure the family line continued if there was no natural male heir. However, this was also governed by strict rules. The adopted son, or yoshi, was typically chosen from a family of equal or slightly lower rank. It was a formal legal process. The mistake was for a family to adopt a son from a much lower class, such as a merchant's son, simply for his family's money. Let's explore the mistake of failing to control one's retainers. A samurai's status was reflected in the conduct of his servants and lower-ranking followers. If a samurai's retainer behaved rudely in a public market, picked a fight, or insulted someone from another clan, the shame fell directly upon the master. The master was expected to manage his household and his men with a firm hand. A lord whose retainers were known to be unruly and undisciplined would lose face among his peers. The unwritten rules of the battlefield, even during times of relative peace, were still taught as part of a samurai's martial education. One key concept was the taking of heads. In the earlier warring states period, a samurai's performance was judged by the number and rank of the heads he took in battle. This practice, while less common in the peaceful Edo period, still informed their mindset. Let's consider the social mistake of being a country samurai, or goshi. These were samurai who lived in rural areas and often farmed their own land, blurring the line between the warrior and peasant classes. While they had the right to a surname and to wear swords, they were often looked down upon by the urban samurai who served directly in a lord's castle town. An urban samurai saw the goshi as unsophisticated and lacking in proper etiquette. The simple act of eating had its own set of rules. Chopsticks, or hashi, were to be used with grace. Sticking your chopsticks vertically into your bowl of rice was a major taboo, as this is how rice is offered to the dead at funerals. Using your chopsticks to point at someone, to spear food, or to pull a communal dish closer to you were all considered rude. You were expected to use a separate pair of serving chopsticks for communal dishes to avoid sharing saliva. The concept of ritual purity extended to geographic locations. Certain mountains were considered sacred, and women were often forbidden from climbing them, a practice known as nyanin kinsei. This was based on beliefs that women were inherently polluting due to menstruation and childbirth, and their presence would anger the mountain's deities. Let's talk about the mistake of being overly emotional in public. A samurai, in particular, was expected to cultivate an attitude of stoic impassivity. To show fear in the face of danger, to cry out in pain, or to laugh too loudly was to display a lack of self-control, the cardinal virtue of the warrior. This ideal of emotional suppression is captured in the phrase from the Hagakure, a famous text on Bushido. The way of the samurai is found in death. The role of the intermediary, or chukaisha, was crucial in preventing social mistakes. If you had a delicate request to make of a superior, or a complaint to lodge against a neighbor, you would not do it directly. This would be too confrontational and risk causing someone to lose face. Instead, you would use a trusted intermediary, a person of good standing who could approach the other party on your behalf. What about medical etiquette? When a doctor, who was often of samurai or at least respected commoner status, visited a patient, there were rules to follow. The doctor would be treated as an honored guest. The family would not bombard him with questions or doubt his diagnosis. Illness itself was a delicate matter. Certain diseases, like leprosy or mental illness, carried a heavy social stigma. Families would often try to hide a relative with such a condition to avoid shame. Let's consider the world of poetry. Composing short poems like haiku or waka was a popular pastime among the educated classes, including samurai. Poetry gatherings were common social events. At these gatherings, there was an etiquette to follow. You were expected to praise the work of others, especially your host or a high-ranking guest, even if you thought it was poor. Direct criticism was unacceptable. The mistake would be to show off your own skill too brazenly or to put down another's attempt. The paths they walked were not just strips of dirt. They were diagrams of power. The center of the road belonged to the noble. The edges were for the common folk, who had to shrink themselves to pass. The justice system had a way of dealing with disputes that avoided formal courts, arbitrated settlements. If two merchants had a business disagreement or two villagers a dispute over land, they would often go to a respected figure in the community, a village headman, a temple priest, or a prominent elder to mediate. This person would hear both sides and propose a compromise. A very specific but critical mistake was to mishandle your family's crest, or mon. The mon was a heraldic symbol that identified a samurai family. It was displayed on their formal clothes, their banners, and their possessions. It was a powerful symbol of identity and lineage. To use another family's mon without permission was a grave offense, tantamount to identity theft. To treat an object bearing your own mon with disrespect was to dishonor your entire family. The concept of retirement, or inkayo, was also a formal social process. When the head of a household became too old to carry out his duties, he would formally retire and pass on the headship to his heir. He would then often move to a separate, smaller dwelling on the family property and live a life of quiet seclusion, perhaps pursuing artistic or religious interests. The mistake was for a retired patriarch to continue to interfere in the running of the household after he had passed on control. Let's talk about the use of fire. In cities like Edo, which were built almost entirely of wood, paper, and bamboo, fire was a constant and terrifying threat. Major fires that could destroy vast sections of the city were a regular occurrence. Because of this, there were strict rules regarding the use of fire and a culture of communal firefighting. The mistake of being careless with a candle or a cooking fire had catastrophic potential. Even something as simple as standing and watching could be a mistake. If a fight or an argument broke out on the street, the wise commoner would not linger to watch the spectacle, especially if a samurai was involved. To be a bystander was to risk being called as a witness, a dangerous and undesirable position. It could also be misinterpreted as gawking or taking pleasure in the conflict. The proper response was to make yourself scarce, to melt back into the crowd and disappear. The concept of debt was not just financial, it was also social. The Japanese have a concept called on, which refers to a debt of gratitude or a social obligation that one has received. This could be a favor from a superior, a kindness from a neighbor, or the fundamental debt one owes to one's parents and lord. This debt is never fully repayable, but you are expected to spend your life trying to repay it through loyalty and service, an obligation known as jiri. Let us consider the role of superstition in daily life. The world was filled with spirits, kami, and ghosts, yurei. There were auspicious days for starting a journey or getting married, and inauspicious directions to avoid. A mistake was to ignore these beliefs. To build a house facing an unlucky direction, or to begin a major undertaking on a day deemed to be cursed, was to invite misfortune. The way one treated swords, even those not their own, was critical. We've talked about not touching a samurai's sword, but the etiquette went deeper. If you were a guest in a home and were shown a valuable blade as an honor, you were expected to follow a strict viewing protocol. You would bow to the sword first, then hold it with a silk cloth so your skin did not touch the steel. You would examine it carefully, keeping the cutting edge pointed away from you and your host. Let's revisit the idea of collective punishment, renza, in a more intimate context. Within a neighborhood, households were often organized into 5 family groups, or ganingumi. These groups were formally responsible for each other's behavior. They had to ensure that no one in the group was breaking the law, evading taxes, or engaging in forbidden activities like practicing Christianity. If one household committed an offense, the other 4 could be punished along with them. The mistake of gossip and rumor mongering was a serious one, though incredibly common. In a society where reputation, or face, was everything, A malicious rumor could be as deadly as a sword. It could ruin a marriage prospect, destroy a business, or lead to a samurai being investigated by his superiors. While people certainly gossiped, to be known as a gossip was to be seen as a troublemaker who undermined community harmony. Even the way one sat was a declaration. There was a seat of honor, the kamiza, furthest from the door, and a humble seat, the shimoza. To mistake your place was to misunderstand your value in the world. The concept of reading the air, or kuki oyamo, is a modern Japanese term, but the skill it describes was absolutely essential in the Edo period. It means the ability to sense the mood of a situation and the unspoken feelings and intentions of the people in it. In a culture that prized indirect communication and the avoidance of confrontation, this was not an optional skill. It was a primary survival mechanism. The mistake was to be a person who could not read the air. Let's consider the social mistake of being a foreigner. For over 200 years, under the sakoku or chained country policy, Japan was almost completely closed off to the outside world. The only Westerners allowed were a small contingent of Dutch traders confined to the tiny island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor. Any other foreigner who landed on Japanese shores, such as a shipwrecked sailor, was to be arrested and in many cases executed. Within the world of martial arts dojos, the relationship between senior and junior students, senpai and kohai, was a microcosm of the entire social structure. The kohai was expected to show deference to the senpai, cleaning the dojo, preparing equipment, and listening to their instruction with humility. The senpai, in turn, had a duty to mentor the kohai. The mistake a junior student could make was to challenge a senior before they were ready, to be arrogant, or to fail to show the proper respect. The mistake of showing cowardice, or okubyo, was perhaps the most profound failure for a samurai. The entire philosophy of Bushido was built on a foundation of courage and a willingness to face death. A samurai who fled from a duel, who hesitated in his duty, or who showed fear in the face of adversity, was considered to have failed in his most basic function. The shame of such an act was so great that seppuku was often the only way to cleanse it. Consider the ritual of the tea ceremony, or chanoyu, in more detail. It was a spiritual discipline disguised as a social grace. Every element was imbued with meaning, reflecting the Zen Buddhist principles of harmony, wa, respect, kei, purity, sei, and tranquility, jaku. The mistake was not just in the physical actions, but in the mindset. To participate in the ceremony with a troubled or distracted mind was to miss the point entirely. The way one aged was also subject to social expectation. Old age was to be a time of serene wisdom and detachment. An older person, especially a samurai who had retired, was expected to be a model of composure and a repository of experience. The mistake was to be a bitter, complaining, or greedy old person. This was seen as a sign of a life poorly lived and a character that had failed to achieve enlightenment or peace. The mistake of being a loud or disruptive neighbor was a serious one in the densely packed cities. With houses made of paper and wood, sound traveled easily. Your life was semi-public whether you liked it or not. The Ganengumi system of neighborhood responsibility meant that your neighbors were formally tasked with monitoring you. A household that was constantly arguing, that held noisy parties, or that was otherwise a nuisance would be reported to the authorities. Let's explore the mistake of improperly disposing of the dead. Funerals were solemn, important rituals, usually handled by Buddhist temples. The body would be washed and dressed, placed in a cask in a seated position, and a wake would be held. Cremation was common, especially in cities. The mistake was to deviate from the proper rituals or to show a lack of respect for the deceased. But the biggest taboo was related to the outcast burycumen, who, as undertakers, handled the physical remains. The mistake of being illiterate for a samurai became increasingly serious during the Edo period. As the warrior class evolved into an administrative class, literacy, numeracy, and a strong knowledge of Confucian texts were essential for getting a good position in the bureaucracy. A samurai who could fight but could not read or write was seen as a relic of a bygone age. He would be relegated to low-level guard duties, while his more scholarly peers managed the domain's finances and laws. Consider the mistake of challenging a duel or being challenged to one without proper cause. Duels were a feature of samurai life, but they were not undertaken lightly. A formal duel was a serious matter to resolve a grave point of honor. To challenge someone over a trivial matter was a sign of a hot-headed and undisciplined nature. Conversely, to refuse a legitimate challenge was an act of cowardice that would result in disgrace. A gift was never just a gift. It was a delicate dance of obligation and humility. The wrapping was as important as the object, and the ritual of giving and receiving was a test of one's grace. The mistake of not understanding the local dialect or customs could be a significant one. While Japan had a unified written language, spoken dialects could vary dramatically from one domain to another. A samurai transferred to a new post in a different part of the country could find himself socially isolated if he could not understand the local nuances. Local festivals, customs, and taboos also varied. The social mistake of being a masterless peasant was also a problem. If a farmer, crushed by taxes, made the decision to abandon his land and flee to the city, he became a rootless person. He was no longer registered to a village and had no official place in society. While some found anonymous work in the cities, they lived in constant fear of being discovered by the authorities. They had no legal rights and could be arrested and forced back to their village, where they would be punished for desertion. Let's consider the mistake of not understanding the symbolism of nature. In Japanese art and culture, certain plants and animals are laden with specific meanings. The pine tree represents longevity and steadfastness. The bamboo represents flexibility and strength. The plum blossom, which blooms in the cold of late winter, represents perseverance. The crane is a symbol of good fortune and long life. The mistake of trying to change one's social class was the ultimate transgression against the entire system. The Shinokosho hierarchy was meant to be hereditary and permanent. A farmer's son was to be a farmer. A samurai's son was to be a samurai. While a few merchants were able to purchase low-ranking samurai status for their sons, this was rare and often looked down upon. For a commoner to pretend to be a samurai was a serious crime that could be punished by death. Let's explore the mistake of breaking a contract, particularly for a merchant. In the bustling commercial world of the cities, a merchant's reputation was his single most valuable asset. Business was often done on credit and with verbal agreements. A merchant who failed to deliver goods as promised, or who defaulted on a loan, would find his reputation destroyed. No one would do business with him again. The merchant guilds, or za, could be ruthless in policing their members. The mistake of failing to understand the power of a written document was a significant one in this increasingly bureaucratic society. A samurai's stipend was confirmed by official records. A merchant's loan was recorded in a ledger. A farmer's tax obligations were written down. While personal honor and verbal agreements were important, a signed and sealed document held immense power. Let's consider the mistake of public nudity. While bathing in public bathhouses, sento, was a communal and non-sexualized activity for men and women, being naked outside of that specific context was unacceptable. To be found drunk and unclothed on the street, for example, was a public disgrace that would lead to arrest and punishment. The rules of modesty were highly context-dependent. What was perfectly normal in the bathhouse was a serious offense on the street. The mistake of being a poor host could damage one's reputation significantly. When you had guests, especially guests of a higher status, you were expected to provide the best possible hospitality, even if it was financially straining. This included providing a multi-course meal, serving high-quality steak, and ensuring their every comfort was met. The host and his family would often eat later, after the guests had finished. The mistake of being a poor guest was equally serious. We've discussed the etiquette of seating and eating, but it also included praising the host's hospitality, the quality of the food, and the beauty of the home's decorations. Upon leaving, and again the next day, you were expected to thank your host profusely. To leave without expressing sufficient gratitude or to later criticize the hospitality you received was a major social failing. Let's talk about the mistake of misusing religious spaces. A Buddhist temple and a Shinto shrine were both sacred, but they served different functions and had different protocols. A Shinto shrine was a place to venerate the kami, the native spirits of Japan. Before entering, you would perform a purification ritual at a water basin. You would approach the main hall, bow, make an offering, ring a bell to get the kami's attention, and then clap twice. In this society, your name was not your own. It belonged to your family, your ancestors, and your lord. To bring shame upon yourself was to tarnish a legacy stretching back through generations. The mistake of mishandling a weapon in a dojo was a cardinal sin. In a martial arts school, safety and discipline were paramount. A student who was careless with a wooden sword, bakken, or a live blade during practice endangered everyone. The master, or sensei, demanded absolute focus. A lapse in concentration that led to an injury or even just a near miss would result in a harsh reprimand. The mistake of disrespecting an elder, regardless of their social class, was a violation of the core Confucian principle of filial piety. While a samurai youth still outranked an elderly farmer, he was expected to treat the farmer with a degree of respect due to his age. To be rude or dismissive to an old person was seen as a sign of poor character. Society was structured not just on a vertical axis of class, but also on a horizontal axis of age and experience. Let's consider the world of the ninja, or shinobi, as a mirror image of samurai society. While the samurai code was all about honor, overt status, and fighting face to face, the ninja's art was one of stealth, deception, and disguise. Their entire purpose was to break the rules that governed polite society in order to gather intelligence or carry out assassinations. The mistake for a ninja was to be seen, to be identified, to let their true purpose be known. The mistake of showing disrespect to a person with a physical disability could be a complex issue. While there was no formal protection for them, the Buddhist value of compassion suggested that those who were suffering should be treated with kindness. However, in a society that valued physical prowess, a disability could also be seen as a sign of bad karma or a family curse. The reaction of others could range from pity to scorn. The mistake of not understanding the geography of power in a city like Edo was a critical error. Certain districts were associated with certain classes or professions. There were the sprawling daimyo mansions in the uptown Yamanote area, the crowded merchant and artisan quarters of the downtown Shitamachi, and the licensed pleasure quarters and theaters on the outskirts. To wander into a tough, low-class neighborhood at night wearing the clothes of a wealthy merchant was to invite robbery. Let's explore the mistake of displaying romantic affection in public. While love and passion were the subject of much art and literature, the public performance of relationships was expected to be extremely formal and reserved. A husband and wife would not hold hands or show physical affection in public. Their relationship was a formal one, based on duty. Public displays of affection were associated with the lower classes or the floating world of courtesans, not with the respectable classes. The mistake of failing at an artistic performance could be socially humiliating. Whether it was a samurai performing the no dance at a formal gathering, a merchant's daughter playing the kodo, a stringed instrument, or a man failing to compose a clever poem at a party, artistic skill was seen as a reflection of one's inner character and refinement. A clumsy or poor performance would lead to a loss of face. This is why people practice these arts with such dedication. Let's consider the mistake of being an unfashionable samurai. While sumptuary laws restricted choices, there were still trends and fashions within the samurai class, especially among the younger generation in Edo. These might involve the color of the scabbard's cord, the style of the top knot, or the pattern of a kimono's lining. A samurai from a remote, rural domain who arrived in Edo might find himself mocked for his country style. The mistake of challenging the authority of a Buddhist temple or Shinto shrine was a serious one. These religious institutions were often major landowners with their own wealth and political influence. Some temples even had their own warrior monks in earlier periods. To get into a legal dispute with a temple over land, or to disrespect a high-ranking priest, was to take on a powerful and well-connected opponent. The mistake of not knowing when to be silent was perhaps one of the most important lessons. In meetings with superiors, at formal dinners, or in any situation involving delicate social dynamics, saying nothing was often the wisest course of action. An ill-considered word could cause offense, while silence could be interpreted as wisdom and composure. The samurai ideal was a man of action, not a man of excessive words. He was expected to listen more than he spoke. They believed in katadama, the spirit of words. Language had the power to shape reality. A careless word, an ill-timed joke, or the wrong level of politeness could unleash unforeseen and terrible consequences. The mistake of forgetting a debt of favor or on was a moral failing of the highest order. If a person helped you get a job, or if a patron supported your business, you were in their debt for life. You were expected to show your gratitude through loyalty, service, and by giving gifts on appropriate occasions. To forget this obligation or to act ungratefully was to reveal yourself as a person of low character. Your name would be mud in the community. As we reflect on this intricate web of rules, it becomes clear that life in samurai Japan was a constant performance. Every individual, from the highest daimyo to the lowest outcast, was on a stage, playing a role dictated by their birth. The script was the rigid social hierarchy, and the audience was everyone else. The deadly mistakes were any deviation from that script, a forgotten line, a clumsy gesture, an unscripted emotion. Let's analyze the psychological impact of living in such a society. The constant need for self-monitoring, the fear of causing offense, and the pressure to conform must have created a tremendous level of ambient anxiety. Every public interaction was a test. This may explain the value placed on private, controlled spaces like the tea room or the garden, where one could, in a highly ritualized way, escape the pressures of the outside world. It is crucial to avoid the mistake of romanticizing the samurai. Popular culture often portrays them as noble, spiritual warriors, and while some individuals may have aspired to the ideals of Bushido, the reality of their class was more complex. They were a ruling elite, a privileged class whose status was maintained by the labor of the peasants and the wealth generated by the merchants. What was the legacy of this world of deadly social mistakes? When the samurai class was abolished during the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, the legal basis for the old hierarchy disappeared. However, the cultural habits ingrained over centuries did not vanish overnight. Let's consider the perspective of a commoner who successfully navigated this world. What skills did they possess? They were masters of observation, constantly aware of their surroundings and the status of those around them. They were skilled actors, able to project an attitude of humility and deference, regardless of their true feelings. They were experts in risk assessment, knowing when to speak and when to be silent, when to make themselves seen, and when to become invisible. The concept of honor, meiyo, was not exclusive to the samurai, though they held the most extreme version of it. A merchant had his commercial honor, his reputation for honesty. An artisan had his professional honor, the pride he took in his craftsmanship. A village had its collective honor. The mistake was to think that only the samurai cared about their reputation. Every group had its own code and its own definition of shame. The role of women as managers of this social code within the home was critical. While the man was the public face of the family, the wife was often the chief operating officer of its social life. She was responsible for knowing the correct way to wrap a gift, the proper etiquette for receiving guests, and the intricate social obligations the family owed to others. She would often guide her husband and children on these matters. Let's reflect on the idea of justice from a different angle. Was there any recourse for a commoner who was wronged by a samurai? It was incredibly difficult, but not entirely impossible. A commoner could try to submit a petition to a higher authority, but this was a dangerous act in itself. A more effective, though still risky, method was the meisubako, or complaint box, which was sometimes set up by the government to allow people to submit anonymous grievances. The ending of this era, with the arrival of Commodore Perry's American black ships in 1853, was a direct result of a massive social mistake on a national level. The Tokugawa shogunate's policy of isolation, sakoku, had created a society that was stable but technologically and militarily stagnant. When faced with the industrial power of the West, the samurai's swords and code of honor were no match for cannons and steamships. The world was a stage, and every person was an actor playing a prescribed role. The script was the rigid social hierarchy. To forget your lines was to invite chaos and often your own final curtain. Consider the irony that the merchant class, officially the lowest, ultimately held the keys to the future. During the Long Peace, they had accumulated vast amounts of capital and created a sophisticated national economy. Many of the lower-ranking but ambitious samurai who led the Meiji Restoration were financed by wealthy merchants. The merchants' pragmatic focus on money and commerce, once disdained by the samurai, became the engine of Japan's modernization. The unwritten rules we have discussed created a society of incredible social density. Every action was freighted with meaning. This fostered a culture of high context, where communication relies heavily on shared understanding and nonverbal cues rather than explicit words. This is a profound legacy. The mistake of being too direct, of spelling everything out, can still be seen as unsophisticated or even rude in many Japanese social contexts. Let's think about the role of art as a release valve. In the kabuki theater and in woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, themes that were dangerous to discuss openly could be explored in disguise. A historical play set centuries earlier could be a thinly veiled commentary on a contemporary political scandal. Prints of beautiful courtesans and dashing actors celebrated a world of emotion and passion that was suppressed in formal society. The endurance of the Bushido code, long after the samurai themselves were gone, is a fascinating phenomenon. In the early 20th century, the code was reinterpreted and promoted by nationalists as a core set of Japanese values, emphasizing loyalty to the emperor and self-sacrifice for the state. This modern, romanticized version of Bushido stripped away much of the historical context of the samurai as a ruling class and repackaged it as a timeless national spirit. We must also acknowledge the regional variations. The deadly social mistakes could differ between a bustling city like Edo and a remote mountain village, or between a domain ruled by a strict traditionalist and one run by a more pragmatic lord. In some areas, the lines between the classes were more blurred. In others, they were enforced with exceptional rigidity. Japan was not a monolith. The legacy of the outcast bureaucracy is one of the most tragic. Even after the four-tiered class system was officially abolished in 1871, the social stigma against them persisted. They continued to face discrimination in marriage, housing, and employment for another century and beyond. The social mistake of being born into this group had consequences that outlived the feudal system that created it. The mistake of underestimating the power of literacy and information among the common classes is another key takeaway. Woodblock printing made books, pamphlets, and prints relatively cheap and accessible. This led to rising literacy rates and the spread of new ideas and cultural trends. The authorities tried to control what was published, but they couldn't stop everything. Let's consider the concept of place. In this society, everything and everyone had a proper place. A sword had its rack, a guest had their seat, a class had its district, a person had their rank. The social order was a reflection of a cosmic order, where harmony was achieved when everything was in its correct position. The fundamental mistake, therefore, was to be out of place. This could mean physically being in the wrong location, or it could mean acting in a way that was inappropriate for your station. The mistake of ignoring the changing seasons was not just a social blunder, but a violation of a core aesthetic and spiritual principle. Life was meant to be lived in harmony with the natural rhythm of the year. This was reflected in the food that was eaten, the festivals that were celebrated, the poems that were written, and the patterns on clothing. To serve a food that was out of season, or to use a poetic image of autumn in the spring, was to be out of tune with the world. Let us think about the mistake of being inflexible. While the rules were rigid, the truly successful person knew when a rule could be bent. A wise lord knew when to show mercy. A savvy merchant knew how much he could get away with. A respected elder knew that sometimes consensus required a creative interpretation of tradition. The society was a constant tension between the official rules amo, the front or facade, and the way things actually got done, yura, the back or reality. The samurai's two swords were not for decoration. They were a constant, physical statement of their authority and their right to enforce the social order with lethal precision. Their presence was a perpetual warning. The world of children was not exempt from these rules. From a young age, children were taught the importance of deference, filial piety, and group harmony. They learned to bow, to use polite language, and to control their emotions. Play itself was often a way of practicing social roles. The mistake a parent could make was to raise a child who was willful, selfish, or disobedient. Such a child would reflect poorly on the entire family. What about humor? Was there any room for it in such a serious world? Yes, but it was a dangerous tool. Satire, as we've seen, could land you in trouble. Puns and wordplay were popular forms of intellectual humor among the educated. For the common classes, there were jesters and storytellers who made a living mocking authority, but they had to be clever, like a court jester, knowing how far they could go. The mistake was to make the wrong joke to the wrong person. The mistake of appearing weak was one a samurai could never afford. This went beyond physical courage. It meant never complaining about hardship, whether it was financial trouble, illness, or personal loss. The samurai was supposed to be above such worldly concerns. He had to project an aura of serene self-sufficiency. To ask for help, especially from a person of lower status, was a humiliating loss of face. This created a culture where people suffered in silence. Let's consider the mistake of being a bad loser. Whether in a game of Go, a poetry contest, or a martial arts bout, the proper response to defeat was grace and humility. To become angry, to make excuses, or to accuse the winner of cheating was a major social failing. It showed a lack of emotional control and an oversized ego. You were expected to congratulate the winner, thank them for the lesson, and resolve to improve yourself. The mistake of not understanding the power of silence is worth re-emphasizing. In the West, we often associate silence in a conversation with awkwardness. In Japan, particularly in this period, silence could be a sign of respect, of deep thought, or of disapproval. A superior might respond to a subordinate's suggestion with silence, which was a clear, unspoken no. A host might allow for long periods of quiet contemplation during a tea ceremony. We should also touch upon the mistake of being unhygienic. The Japanese culture of this period placed a high value on cleanliness, which was tied to the Shinto concept of purity. The practice of daily bathing, either at home or in public bathhouses, was common. Homes were kept clean, and the custom of removing shoes before entering was universal. To be dirty or to have a messy home was not just a personal failing. It was a sign of a disordered and undisciplined character. Let us look at the mistake of being a poor judge of character. For a samurai lord, this could be a fatal flaw. He had to surround himself with advisors who were loyal, competent, and trustworthy. To promote a man who was secretly ambitious and disloyal, or to trust the advice of a fool, could lead to the ruin of his entire domain. For a merchant, trusting the wrong partner could lead to bankruptcy. The mistake of envy was considered a deeply corrosive emotion. To be openly envious of someone's success, status, or wealth was a sign of a small and bitter spirit. It disrupted group harmony and bred resentment. The proper attitude was to either be happy for the other person's good fortune or to maintain a stoic indifference. Of course, people felt envy, but the key was to never let it show. Let's analyze the mistake of being impatient. The culture valued slow, deliberate action. A craftsman would spend years perfecting his skill. A student would spend years mastering the basics before attempting to innovate. A social negotiation would proceed through multiple, slow stages with an intermediary. To be impatient, to want results immediately, was to be seen as shallow and foolish. It showed a lack of appreciation for the proper process. The mistake of being a bad drunk was more than just an embarrassment. While sake was a part of social life, losing control was a serious problem, especially for a samurai. A samurai who, under the influence of alcohol, revealed a secret, insulted a superior, or started a brawl could find his career ruined or his life forfeit. The term sake no seki, or a seat for sake, implied a certain license, but there were still limits. A person who was known to be a mean or sloppy drunk would be avoided. Consider the farmer, bowing low in the rice paddy as a lord passed by. His survival depended not just on the harvest, but on his ability to perform this ritual of deference perfectly, every single time. The mistake of not showing proper respect for one's ancestors was a violation of the entire social and spiritual fabric. The family was seen as a continuous line stretching into the past and future. The ancestors were not gone. They were still a presence, watching over the family from the household's Buddhist altar, or butsuden. Regular offerings of rice and incense were made, and the ancestors were informed of major family events. Let's consider the mistake of being too individualistic. The Western ideal of the rugged individual who forges their own path in defiance of society would have been seen as monstrous in samurai Japan. The self was defined not in opposition to the group, but as a part of it. Your identity was your role. You were a son of the Tanaka family, a retainer of Lord Oda, a resident of the village of Sano. The mistake of refusing a reasonable request from a superior was unthinkable. The entire system was built on a chain of command. If your village headman asked you to contribute labor for a community project, you did it. If your samurai lord ordered you to go to a distant post, you went. To refuse was not an option. It was insubordination. This created a society that could be mobilized with incredible efficiency, but it also left little room for personal autonomy. The mistake of being a poor storyteller or public speaker could be a handicap. While silence was valued, there were times when a samurai had to report to his lord, or a village headman had to address the community. To be able to speak clearly, concisely, and persuasively was a valuable skill. To mumble, to be disorganized in your thoughts, or to use inappropriate language would reflect poorly on you. Eloquence was a sign of a clear mind. Let's consider the mistake of not understanding the value of a beautiful object. In this culture, aesthetics were not frivolous. A beautifully crafted tea bowl, a well-composed scroll of calligraphy, or a finely decorated sword guard were not just objects. They were expressions of a cultivated spirit. To be unable to appreciate the subtle beauty of such things was to reveal a lack of refinement. The mistake of being caught in a lie was catastrophic for one's reputation. A samurai's word was supposed to be as good as a signed contract. To be exposed as a liar was to lose all credibility. For a merchant, a reputation for dishonesty would be the end of his business. While people certainly engaged in deception, the social consequences of being caught were severe. This is why so much communication was indirect and ambiguous. Let's explore the mistake of being unprepared. A samurai was expected to be ready for a sudden attack at any moment. His swords were always close at hand. His mind was trained to be constantly aware of his surroundings. This state of constant readiness was known as zanshin. It is a concept from the martial arts that means a continued state of awareness even after a technique is executed. To be caught off guard, to be surprised, was a sign of a lapse in this discipline. The mistake of showing pity for an enemy who had been justly defeated was a complex one. While compassion was a Buddhist virtue, the samurai code often demanded ruthlessness. After a battle or a duel, the victor was expected to be stoic. To show excessive sympathy for the vanquished could be interpreted as weakness or as a criticism of the outcome. The proper response was a kind of grim respect for a fellow warrior who had met his fate. The mistake of mismanaging the family finances could bring ruin. This was a particular problem for the samurai class. They had high social status and were expected to maintain a certain lifestyle, but their income was a fixed stipend of rice that did not always keep up with inflation. Many samurai were in perpetual debt to merchants. The mistake of violating a sacred space was a profound transgression. This went beyond just temples and shrines. A particular grove of trees, a waterfall, or a mountain could be considered the dwelling place of a kami. To cut down a sacred tree or to pollute a sacred spring was not just an environmental crime. It was an act of sacrilege that could bring the wrath of the spirits down upon the community. The merchant, though wealthy, had to hide his riches behind a veneer of simplicity. To display wealth was to challenge the samurai's status, a provocation that could cost him more than just his money. Let's consider the mistake of being a poor teacher. A master of a craft, a martial art, or a scholarly tradition had a duty to pass on his knowledge to the next generation. A good teacher was patient, demanding, and a role model for his students. A bad teacher was one who was selfish with his knowledge, who was unclear in his instruction, or who did not live up to the principles he taught. The bond between master and student was one of deep loyalty and respect. The mistake of not knowing your own lineage was to not know yourself. A samurai was expected to be able to recite the great deeds of his ancestors. His family's history was his own. This is why meticulous family records were kept. This connection to the past gave a person their place in the present. For a commoner, knowing that your family had farmed the same land for generations provided a deep sense of identity and belonging. To be ignorant of your roots was to be adrift. The mistake of being ungrateful to a patron was social suicide. In a society based on hierarchical relationships, having a powerful patron was essential for advancement. This patron, or oyabun, literally father figure, would provide opportunities and protection. In return, the client, or kabun, child figure, owed the patron absolute loyalty and service. To betray a patron, to switch allegiance, or to simply fail to show sufficient gratitude was an unforgivable sin. Let's reflect on the mistake of being too trusting. While loyalty was prized, the world of samurai politics was also rife with intrigue, betrayal, and conspiracy. A wise lord was a paranoid lord. He trusted his close advisors, but he also had systems in place to watch them. He understood that a rival could be plotting against him, or that one of his own retainers might be tempted by a better offer from another clan. The mistake of ignoring the power of ritual was to misunderstand the society itself. From the grand procession of a daimyo to the small, precise gestures of the tea ceremony, life was a series of rituals. These were not empty formalities. They were the mechanisms that reinforced the social order, affirmed relationships, and gave meaning to daily existence. Rituals provided a sense of predictability and stability in a world that could be harsh and uncertain. Let's analyze the mistake of being a bad guest on a larger scale. The alternate attendance system, sankinkatai. When a daimyo and his retinue were in Edo, they were guests in the shogun's city. To cause trouble there, for their retainers to get into brawls with the retinues of other lords, was a serious political mistake. It could be seen as a sign of disrespect to the shogun's authority. The daimyo had to manage their men carefully. The mistake of not providing for your family's future was a grave one. A father had a duty to ensure his heir was well educated and prepared to take over the family headship. He had to arrange good marriages for his children. He had to manage the family's assets so that they were not left in debt. To fail in these duties was to fail his ancestors and his descendants. It was a betrayal of the sacred trust of continuing the family line. The mistake of being seen as nouveau rich was a problem for the newly wealthy merchants. They had money, but they lacked the centuries of breeding and cultural capital of the samurai. To simply buy expensive things was seen as vulgar. The truly sophisticated merchant learned to patronize the arts, to master the tea ceremony, and to cultivate an air of quiet refinement. They had to learn the language of high culture to be accepted, or at least respected, by the elite. The mistake of misinterpreting a poem could be a significant social error. Poetry was a common medium for communication, especially for delicate subjects. A poem could contain a subtle romantic invitation, a political warning, or a veiled insult. To not understand the allusions and metaphors was to miss the real message entirely. To respond with a poem that showed you had misunderstood was a source of embarrassment. Let's consider the mistake of breaking the harmony of a gathering. Whether it was a formal banquet, a poetry circle, or a simple neighborhood meeting, The goal was to maintain a pleasant and harmonious atmosphere. A person who introduced a controversial topic, who started an argument, or who was otherwise disruptive would be seen as a social failure. This person did not understand the importance of wa. Imagine a world painted on a delicate silk scroll. The lines are precise, the colors have deep meaning, and a single errant drop of ink could ruin the entire masterpiece. This was the canvas of society in samurai Japan. The very clothes you wore were a uniform, dictating your class and your place. Silk was for the elite, hemp for the peasant. To dress above your station was a silent rebellion the authorities would not tolerate. The mistake of not respecting the tools of one's trade was a sign of a poor craftsman. A swordsmith would perform purification rituals before forging a blade. A carpenter would treat his chisels and planes with immense care. A calligrapher would meticulously clean his brushes. This respect for one's tools was a reflection of the respect for the craft itself. It was a recognition that skill resided not just in the person, but in the partnership between the artisan and their instruments. The mistake of being a poor messenger was a serious one. In a society without electronic communication, information was carried by people. A messenger had to be reliable, fast, and discreet. He had to be able to accurately relay a verbal message or to protect a written one. A messenger who was slow, who lost the message, or who could be bribed to reveal its contents was worse than useless. The mistake of being a fair-weather friend was a moral failing. Loyalty was expected to be absolute, in good times and in bad. If a friend or a patron fell on hard times, you were expected to stand by them, even at risk to yourself. To abandon someone as soon as they lost their status or wealth was to reveal yourself as a person of shallow and opportunistic character. Let's consider the mistake of not understanding the aesthetics of poverty. This is a complex idea, but it was important. The Zen-influenced aesthetic of wabi-sabi found beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and simplicity. A cracked tea bowl could be more valuable than a perfect one, because its history and imperfection gave it character. A samurai who was poor in material wealth could still have immense spiritual wealth by cultivating this aesthetic. The mistake of desecrating a grave was a horrifying offense. The grave was the physical link to the ancestors, a place of memory and respect. To damage a tombstone or to otherwise disrespect a gravesite was an attack on the entire family, living and dead. It was seen as an act of profound malice, and if the culprit was caught, the punishment would be severe. The connection between the living and the dead was a palpable reality, and the grave was the sacred ground where those two worlds met. The mistake of being a know-it-all was a social sin. Humility was a key virtue. Even if you were an expert on a subject, you were not supposed to flaunt your knowledge. You should listen respectfully to the opinions of others, even if they were less informed. To constantly correct people or to dominate a conversation with your own expertise was seen as arrogant and rude. The truly wise person was supposed to be humble, to guide others to the right answer rather than simply declaring it. Let's consider the mistake of being inhospitable to a traveler. In a country where travel was common for pilgrims and merchants, there was a tradition of offering hospitality. A traveler who was caught in a storm might seek shelter at a farmhouse or a temple. To turn them away, unless they were obviously dangerous, was considered a breach of basic human compassion. The mistake of not paying a proper New Year's visit was a major social blunder. The New Year was the most important festival, a time for renewal, and for settling the social accounts of the previous year. You were expected to pay a formal visit to your superiors, patrons, and important contacts to offer good wishes for the year ahead. To fail to do so was a sign of disrespect that would be noted and remembered. The mistake of being a sore winner was just as bad as being a bad loser. If you won a contest or a duel, you were not supposed to gloat or celebrate excessively. This would humiliate your opponent and show a lack of magnanimity. The proper response was to be gracious, to acknowledge the skill of your opponent, and to express humility in victory. This preserved the dignity of the loser and maintained the harmony of the situation. The mistake of not knowing the proper way to sit is a small but telling detail. For formal situations, the correct way to sit was seiza, kneeling with the legs folded underneath the thighs. To sit in this position for long periods is painful for the uninitiated, but it was expected. It promoted good posture and a sense of alertness. To fidget or complain while in seiza was a sign of poor discipline. A woman's world was even more constricted, a smaller, more intricate box of rules. Her virtue was her family's honor, and a single rumor, true or not, could lead to divorce, disgrace, or death. The mistake of being a ronin of the tongue, a person whose words have no master, was to be a social pariah. This described someone who was unreliable, who made promises they didn't keep, or whose speech was careless and insulting. A samurai's primary loyalty was to his lord. His words should serve that loyalty. A person whose words served only their own ego or whims was seen as a dangerous and untrustworthy element. As our journey through this world of unwritten rules comes to a close, what can we say we have learned? We have seen a society that prized order above all else, a world constructed to prevent the chaos of war from ever returning. This order was maintained not just by swords and laws, but by a pervasive, all-encompassing code of social conduct. It was a code that governed every bow, every word, every gesture. The pressure to conform was immense, but we should not make the mistake of thinking that people in samurai Japan were mindless automatons. They were human beings who loved, hated, schemed, and dreamed, just as we do. They navigated the system with skill and intelligence. They found ways to express themselves within the confines of the rules, through subtle poetry, hidden luxuries, and the rich culture of the floating world. It is a profound paradox that a society so focused on harmony and the avoidance of confrontation was built upon a warrior class with the legal right to kill. But the two sides were intrinsically linked. The threat of violence was the ultimate enforcer of the harmony. The reason a commoner bowed so low was because of the two swords worn by the samurai. The reason a samurai was so concerned with his honor was because a loss of face could lead to a duel or an order to commit seppuku. The legacy of this period in modern Japan is undeniable, but it is also complex and often misunderstood. The modern Japanese emphasis on politeness, group consensus, and public order can be seen as a descendant of this older world. However, it has been transformed. The motivations are now rooted in civic sense and cultural preference, not in the fear of a swordsman's wrath. To make a social mistake in Tokyo today might lead to embarrassment or awkwardness, but not to death. So what is the ultimate takeaway for us, looking back from our modern, individualistic societies? Perhaps it is a deeper appreciation for the concept of social context. We learn that the meaning of an action is not inherent in the action itself, but is defined by the culture in which it takes place. A direct gaze can be a sign of honesty or a sign of aggression. A moment of silence can be awkward or it can be profound. We can also reflect on the eternal tension between the needs of the group and the rights of the individual. The Society of Samurai Japan represents an extreme point on this spectrum, where the group was elevated to a position of absolute primacy. This created a society of incredible stability and artistic refinement, but it came at the cost of personal freedom and immense human suffering, especially for those at the bottom of the hierarchy. The story of the merchant class offers a hopeful counter-narrative. Despite being officially at the bottom, their ingenuity, wealth, and cultural vitality constantly challenged the rigid hierarchy. They created a vibrant urban culture, patronized new forms of art, and built the economic foundations for a new Japan. Their story shows that even in the most restrictive systems, human creativity and ambition will find a way to flourish. Let's consider the physical artifacts left from this period. A sharp katana, a serene tea bowl, a detailed woodblock print, a crumbling castle wall. When we look at these objects now, we can see them not just as museum pieces, but as silent witnesses to the world we have explored. The katana is not just a weapon, it is the embodiment of a samurai's honor and his lethal authority. The tea bowl is not just pottery, it is a vessel for a moment of prescribed tranquility. The emotional landscape of this period is equally important. The constant performance of stoicism, the suppression of personal feelings, the fear of losing face. All of this created a rich and complex inner world. This is why their stories are so often tragedies, tales of impossible love or of conflicts between duty and emotion. These stories were a way of exploring the feelings that could not be expressed in daily life. Art became the repository for the suppressed heart of the culture. We speak of face, the concept of public image and dignity. In samurai Japan, losing face was not a momentary embarrassment. It was a social death, a wound from which it was almost impossible to recover. In the end, the system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and its inability to adapt to a changing world. The samurai, trained for war, became obsolete in a time of peace. The merchants, disdained as parasites, became the economic engine of the nation. The isolation that was meant to protect the society ultimately made it vulnerable. Today, as we travel to Japan, we may see people bowing politely, exchanging business cards with two hands, or deferring to seniors. We might see the shadow of this old world in these gestures, but it is only a shadow. The passion, the danger, the life and death stakes that once animated these rituals are gone. What remains is the form, the cultural habit, a muscle memory passed down through generations. The world of deadly social mistakes in samurai Japan was a world of profound discipline, beauty, and terror. It was a society that achieved a remarkable degree of order and artistic refinement, but at a tremendous human cost. It demonstrates how a society's values can be encoded into every aspect of daily life, turning simple interactions into high-stakes performances. By understanding the rules that people were forbidden to break, we gain a much clearer picture of what that society truly valued: loyalty over honesty, the group over the individual, duty over desire, and order over everything. These were not abstract ideals. They were practical guidelines for survival. The mistakes were deadly because they threatened to unravel this delicate, tightly woven social fabric. The fear they inspired was the thread that held everything together. To imagine ourselves in that world is a humbling exercise. Would we have the social intelligence, the self-control, the constant vigilance to survive? Could we navigate the labyrinth of etiquette where a wrong look or a misplaced word could be a death sentence? It gives us a new respect for the ordinary people of that time, who performed this difficult dance every single day of their lives. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. I hope this exploration has given you a deeper understanding of this fascinating and complex period of history. It reminds us that behind the grand narratives of lords and shoguns are the intimate, often perilous, realities of daily life. It is in these small, forgotten rules that we can often find the true soul of a lost world. Thank you for watching. Imagine stepping into a room and instantly knowing your exact position relative to every other person there. This was not a skill. It was a basic necessity for survival, an instinct honed by a lifetime of observation. The game of Go, with its black and white stones, offers another lesson. A single, poorly placed stone could compromise your entire position. Social life was a strategic board, and the stakes were infinitely higher. They listened for the rustle of silk, the clink of a sword, the soft padding of tabi socks on a wooden floor. Every sound was information, a clue to who was approaching and what level of respect was required. Even looking directly into the eyes of a superior could be seen as an act of aggression, a challenge to their authority. Humility demanded a lowered gaze, a physical manifestation of your acceptance of their dominance. The seasons governed their lives, not just in agriculture, but in art, poetry, and dress. To be out of sync with the season, to wear the wrong pattern, was to be out of sync with the harmony of the universe. Laughter was a luxury, and often a dangerous one. A joke could be misinterpreted as mockery. Public displays of emotion were a sign of poor discipline, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of control. The sword test, or tameshijiri, sometimes involved testing a new blade on the bodies of convicted criminals. This practice underscored the chilling reality that human life could be treated as a mere object to prove a point. Here, a whisper could carry the weight of a scream. Averting your eyes at the wrong moment was not shyness, but an act of defiance. Every breath was measured against a code of honor as sharp as any blade. Your neighbors were not just neighbors, they were your judges. The community operated on a system of collective responsibility. Your mistake could bring punishment upon your entire street or village. Your shame was their shame. The most fearsome samurai were not always the ones who fought in battles. They were the ones who had mastered the silent, brutal politics of the court, where a misplaced word was deadlier than a sword thrust. Entering a samurai's home required a ritual of its own. You would leave your long sword at the entrance, a gesture of trust. But the dagger, the wakizashi, often remained, a sign that trust was never absolute. The world was divided into a strict hierarchy: samurai, farmer, artisan, and merchant. But below them all were the outcasts, the burycumen who handled death and leather. For them, every social rule was magnified, and every interaction was fraught with peril. The very act of speaking your mind, of offering an unsolicited opinion, was a transgression. The group's harmony, the wa, was paramount. A dissenting voice was a discordant note that must be silenced. Imagine the tension of a formal meal, where the clatter of a chopstick or a slurp of soup at the wrong time could signify a lack of breeding. Every bite was a performance of your social standing. The law was not always written down. It existed in precedent, in custom, and in the mood of the local lord. This ambiguity was a weapon, keeping everyone in a state of constant, cautious uncertainty. The fan, a simple object of beauty, was also a tool of communication. The way it was held, opened, or gestured with could convey subtle messages of agreement, disdain, or invitation, unreadable to the uninitiated. To touch a samurai's sword, even accidentally, was a profound offense. It was akin to touching his soul, a violation that could, and often did, demand a swift and bloody apology. The concept of loyalty was absolute. Loyalty to one's lord or daimyo superseded loyalty to one's own family. You could be ordered to sacrifice your child, your spouse, or yourself, and to refuse was unthinkable. Consider the cherry blossom, the sakura. It is celebrated not for its longevity, but for the beauty of its brief existence before it falls. Life, too, was seen this way, a fleeting, beautiful thing that could be scattered by a sudden gust of dishonor. The floating world, the world of theaters and tea houses, offered a temporary escape from these rigid rules. But even there, hierarchies existed, and a misstep could see you thrown back into the harsh reality outside. Your personal feelings were irrelevant. Your duty, your jiri, was everything. To act based on personal desire, ninjo, over duty was the path to ruin and a common theme in their tragic stories. The Ronin, the masterless samurai, was a figure of both fear and pity. He was a man untethered from the social order, a walking embodiment of failure and a potential source of unpredictable violence. Even the way you walked communicated status. A samurai's stride was confident and measured, while a commoner's was hurried and deferential, their body language a constant apology for taking up space. Consider the weight of a promise. A samurai's word, once given, was an unbreakable bond. To go back on it was to destroy his own honor, rendering him worthless in the eyes of his peers. The family register, the kosuke, was a meticulous record of your lineage. It was your identity document, and a black mark on it for a crime or social disgrace would follow your descendants for generations. The garden was not a place of wild nature. It was a controlled, symbolic landscape. Every rock was placed with intent, every tree pruned to perfection, mirroring the desire for a perfectly controlled social environment. Revenge was not just a crime of passion, it was sometimes a social duty. A son was expected to avenge the wrongful death of his father to restore the family's honor, even at the cost of his own life. The most dangerous place in Japan was not a battlefield, but a quiet room where powerful men gathered. Here, status was the weapon, etiquette was the armor, and a single mistake was a fatal wound. This was a society built on a foundation of should and must not. It was a web of obligations so tightly woven that to struggle against one thread was to alert the spider to your presence. The katana, the soul of the samurai, was not merely a weapon. It was a symbol of status, a tool of justice, and a constant, visible reminder that a final consequence was always within arm's reach. So before we delve into the specific rules, let this atmosphere settle. A world of quiet intensity, where social survival depended on mastering a silent, unwritten language. The stakes could not have been higher. Let us begin with the most terrifyingly direct of all social rules, the one that perfectly encapsulates the deadly part of our title. It is a concept known as kiri-sute gomen, which translates to permission to cut down and leave. This was a legal right granted to the samurai class, allowing them to strike down with their sword any member of the lower classes, a commoner, a farmer, an artisan, a merchant, who had insulted them. The insult did not have to be a physical assault. To understand why a rule like kiri-sute gomen could exist, we must understand the very foundation of Edo period society. This was the Shinokosho, the four-tiered social hierarchy that was Neo-Confucian in origin and brutally effective in practice. At the absolute pinnacle was the samurai, the shi. They were the warriors, the administrators, the scholars, and the rulers. Their role was to govern and protect, and their privilege was absolute. Central to the samurai's identity and the justification for their lethal privileges was the concept of honor or meiyo. This wasn't just about personal integrity. It was a samurai's entire public worth, his reputation, and the reputation of his family and his lord. Closely tied to this was mentsu, or face. To be publicly insulted was to have your face smashed. It was an intolerable stain that had to be wiped clean, often with blood. The samurai's right to wear two swords, the daisho, a long katana and a shorter wakizashi, was the most potent symbol of their status. No other class was permitted this privilege. These swords were not simply accessories. They were a constant, visible representation of the samurai's authority and his right to use lethal force. When a commoner saw a samurai approaching, the first thing they would notice were the swords. This immediately triggered a set of deeply ingrained behaviors. Beyond the threat of immediate violence, the bow, or ajigi, was the most common and complex social ritual of daily life, and a minefield for potential mistakes. It was far more than a simple greeting. The bow was a precise social barometer, instantly communicating the relationship and relative status between two people. Just as crucial as body language was the spoken word, governed by a complex system of honorifics and polite language known as keigo. This is not simply a matter of being polite. It is a grammatical system woven into the very structure of the Japanese language. The act of giving and receiving gifts, or zodo, was another area fraught with social danger. A gift was rarely a simple gesture of goodwill. It was part of a complex system of social obligation and debt. When you received a gift, you were expected to reciprocate with a gift of roughly half the value, a practice known as akishi. The timing and presentation were critical. The gift itself had to be appropriate for the season and the recipient's status. Visiting someone's home was not a casual affair. It was a sequence of rituals that had to be perfectly executed. Upon arrival, you would announce your presence from the entrance or jenkin and wait to be invited in. You would remove your shoes, placing them neatly together, pointing towards the door. The host would then guide you to the formal guest room. A critical mistake was to sit in the wrong place. The very act of walking down a street was governed by unwritten rules of status. The center of the road was implicitly reserved for high-ranking samurai and their retinues. Commoners were expected to keep to the sides. When a lord's procession, a daimyo jyoretsu, passed by, the rules became lethally strict. Everyone had to stop what they were doing, move to the side of the road, and prostrate themselves on the ground, their heads bowed low. No one was allowed to look at the lord. In the quiet, deliberate movements of the tea ceremony we find a perfect metaphor. Every gesture was codified, every utensil placed with purpose. A clumsy hand or an impatient sip revealed a disordered mind, a dangerous flaw. For women of the samurai class, life was a prison of meticulously crafted rules. Their world was governed by the Neo-Confucian text Onadaegaku, or Greater Learning for Women, which preached the three obediences. A woman was to obey her father as a girl, her husband as a wife, and her eldest son as a widow. Her primary purpose was to marry, serve her husband and his family, and produce a male heir. While samurai women were constrained by the demands of honor and lineage, women of the merchant class, or chonin, experienced a different set of pressures. Though officially ranked at the bottom of the hierarchy, successful merchant families could be incredibly wealthy. However, this wealth had to be managed with extreme care. A merchant's wife might run the family business alongside her husband and have more practical influence and economic power than her samurai counterpart. A woman's value, particularly in the samurai class, was intrinsically linked to her ability to produce a male heir to continue the family line. This biological function was elevated to a primary social duty. A wife who failed to bear a son could be divorced on these grounds alone. This placed immense psychological pressure on women. The birth of a daughter, while not a disgrace, was often a disappointment. To secure her position within her husband's family, a wife needed to provide a successor. The concept of jealousy was considered a major failing in a woman and a source of domestic strife. A samurai might have official concubines, particularly if his wife had not produced an heir, and the wife was expected to accept this reality with grace and composure. Showing jealousy or creating conflict within the household was a serious transgression. It demonstrated a lack of discipline and a failure to prioritize the stability of the family line over her own personal feelings, or ninjo. For women across all classes, physical appearance and public presentation were strictly regulated. A key element of this was the application of makeup, which signaled status, age, and marital status. A married woman, for instance, would practice ohaguro, the custom of blackening her teeth. While strange to modern eyes, this was considered a mark of beauty and fidelity. She would also shave her eyebrows and paint on new, higher ones. Let's turn our attention to the vast majority of the population, the farmers or no. Constituting over 80% of the populace, their lives were defined by hard labor and a constant, crushing burden of taxation. A farmer's primary duty was to produce rice, the currency of the feudal economy, and surrender a large portion of it, often 40 to 50%, to the local samurai lord. The artisans, or ko, occupied a social space between the farmers and merchants. They were the craftsmen who made everything from swords and armor for the samurai to ceramics, textiles, and woodblock prints for the wider populace. Their social standing was tied to their skill. A master swordsmith, for instance, could be highly respected and patronized by powerful lords, affording him a status far beyond that of a simple craftsman. The merchants, or chonin, present a fascinating paradox. Officially, they were at the bottom of the four-tiered system, viewed as unproductive and driven by greed. Yet, as Japan enjoyed a long period of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, a vibrant commercial economy flourished, and many merchants became far wealthier than the samurai they were supposed to serve. This created immense social tension. The deadliest mistake a merchant could make was to be ostentatious. At the very bottom of society, existing completely outside the four-tiered system, were the outcasts, known as Ada or Hinin, today referred to as bureaucramen. These were people whose professions were considered unclean due to their association with death or defilement in Buddhist and Shinto beliefs. They were butchers, tanners, executioners, and undertakers. They were forced to live in segregated hamlets, could not marry outside their class, and had to adhere to a humiliating set of social rules. Now, let's explore the formal system of justice. When a social mistake escalated into a crime, the consequences were swift and brutal. The legal system of the Edo period was designed to maintain order and reinforce the hierarchy, not to ensure fairness in the modern sense. Guilt was often presumed, and confessions were considered essential for a conviction. This led to the widespread and legal use of torture to extract them. Think of the paper shoji screens that formed the walls of their homes. They offered privacy, but they were also translucent. You were always visible, always heard, always being judged by the shadows you cast. Punishment in samurai Japan was a public spectacle, designed to inspire terror and ensure compliance. The forms of execution were varied and often gruesome, tailored to the nature of the crime and the social status of the criminal. Crucifixion was used for particularly heinous crimes like murdering a master. Burning at the stake was the punishment for arson, a terrifying prospect in cities built of wood and paper. For most common criminals, simple beheading was the standard. What happened when a samurai himself made a grave social mistake? What if he disgraced his lord, showed cowardice, or violated the code of Bushido? For him, the ultimate punishment, and paradoxically the ultimate path to redemption, was seppuku, often known in the West by the more vulgar term harakiri. This was ritual suicide by disembowelment. It was not a simple act of desperation. Let's reconsider the kiri-sute gomen, the right to kill a disrespectful commoner. While this right was legally enshrined, it was not a license for samurai to engage in random slaughter. After striking someone down, the samurai had to report the incident to the authorities immediately and provide witnesses who could testify to the nature of the commoner's insult. If his justification was found to be weak or false, the samurai himself could face severe punishment, including being forced to commit seppuku. The concept of the vendetta, or katekyachi, was another area where social rules and violence intersected. While personal revenge was generally outlawed, the avenging of a parent or a lord was considered a sacred duty under the code of Bushido. If a samurai's father was murdered, for instance, he was socially and ethically obligated to hunt down and kill the murderer. However, he couldn't just go on a rampage. He had to first petition the authorities for permission to carry out the vendetta. Let's delve deeper into the intricate world of language. We've discussed keigo, but the nuances went even further. Pronouns were a minefield. There were numerous ways to say I, you, and he, she, each one loaded with information about status and relationship. A samurai might refer to himself with a humble term when speaking to his lord, but use an assertive, high-status term when addressing a peasant. Using the wrong you for a person could be a grave insult. The rules extended even to the naming of people. It was considered extremely disrespectful to refer to a person of higher status by their personal name. You would use their family name followed by a respectful suffix like sama or don. For the highest-ranking nobles or the shogun himself, you would use their title alone. A commoner would never dare to utter the personal name of his lord. To do so would be an act of shocking and punishable familiarity. We've mentioned the importance of clothing, but the sumptuary laws were incredibly specific. It wasn't just about the material, but also the color and pattern. Bright colors like crimson or purple were often reserved for the highest nobility. Certain patterns, particularly those featuring auspicious symbols like cranes or turtles, might also be restricted. A farmer was expected to wear simple, indigo-dyed hemp or cotton. Even public entertainment was a potential minefield of social errors. The kabuki theater, for instance, was a hugely popular art form, particularly among the merchant class. However, the government of the shogun viewed it with suspicion. They saw it as a corrupting influence, a place where social classes mingled too freely and where samurai could waste their money and neglect their duties. The world of the samurai was filled with subtle status symbols beyond their swords. The quality of the fittings on their scabbards, the material of the hilt trapping, the crest mown on their formal kimono, all of these were indicators of rank and wealth. Another was the fan. In the heat of a Japanese summer, everyone used a fan, but a samurai's fan was different. It could be an iron-ribbed war fan, or tesson, a potential weapon in its own right. Let's consider the concept of purity and pollution, which was central to Shinto belief and permeated daily life. Death, blood, and illness were considered polluting. This is why professions that dealt with them, like tanning and undertaking, were relegated to the outcast burycumen. The art of calligraphy, or shodo, values the single, uncorrectable brushstroke. Similarly, a social misstep was an indelible black mark on your character, a mistake that could not be painted over or erased. The act of drinking sake or rice wine was also bound by strict etiquette, especially in formal settings. One never poured their own drink. It was a constant reciprocal exchange. You would pour for the person next to you and they would pour for you. When someone poured for you, you were expected to lift your small cup, or sakazuki, with one hand while supporting its base with the other. To refuse a drink from a superior could be seen as an insult. Let's re-examine the road, not just in the context of a lord's procession, but in everyday travel. The infrastructure itself was a reflection of the hierarchy. The 5 great highways, like the Takeido Road, were maintained by the shogunate primarily for official travel. Dotted along these roads were post stations, or shukuba, where travelers could rest. However, not all inns were open to everyone. There were high-class inns, the hanjin, which were reserved exclusively for daimyo and high-ranking officials. What about the world of commerce, the marketplace? While a place of lively exchange, it was also governed by implicit rules. Haggling was common, but it had to be done with a certain decorum. A samurai, however, was not supposed to haggle. To do so would be beneath his dignity, as it would show an unseemly concern for money. He was expected to pay the asking price. This often put samurai, who were paid in fixed stipends of rice that often lost value, at a disadvantage to savvy merchants. The concept of group harmony, or wa, was a cornerstone of Japanese society, and it had profound implications for social behavior. The preservation of a harmonious atmosphere within a group, be it a family, a village, or a lord's retinue, was considered more important than individual expression or even objective truth. A social mistake was to be the nail that sticks up, as the famous proverb goes, because it will be hammered down. Let's consider the role of the masterless samurai, the Ronin. After the great wars of the 16th century ended and the Tokugawa shogunate established peace, many samurai found themselves without a lord to serve. They were adrift in a society that was built on loyalty and service. A Ronin was an anomaly, a man trained for war in a time of peace. While some became respected teachers or scholars, many struggled to survive, becoming bodyguards, mercenaries, or even bandits. Even in the arts, strict hierarchies of master and apprentice, or imoto, governed the transmission of knowledge. Whether it was flower arranging ikebana, theater no, or martial arts, the imoto system ensured that the correct forms were passed down through generations. The headmaster of a school had absolute authority. The mistake an apprentice could make was to challenge the master's teachings or to try and innovate too quickly. Let's discuss a very specific but deadly mistake, interrupting someone during the act of seppuku. The ritual was a samurai's final, sacred performance to reclaim his honor. The role of the kaishikunin, the second who performed the decapitation, was one of immense trust and skill. He had to strike at the perfect moment, after the samurai had made his cut, but before he showed any sign of pain or loss of composure. To strike too early would be to cheat the samurai of his honorable death. The family was the fundamental unit of society, and the household head, typically the eldest male, held immense power. He made all major decisions, from whom his children would marry to what professions they would pursue. A deadly mistake for a son was to defy his father's wishes. This was not just a family squabble, it was a violation of filial piety, a core Confucian value. Consider the architecture of a samurai residence, or yashiki. It was designed not just for living, but for defense and the enforcement of social norms. The public reception rooms were separate from the private family quarters. The floors in some corridors, known as nightingale floors or yugasubari, were designed to squeak when walked upon, making it impossible for anyone to move through the house undetected. The legal distinction between different classes was absolute. A samurai was subject to a different set of laws than a commoner. While a samurai could be ordered to commit seppuku for a grave offense, this was considered an honorable death. A commoner who committed a similar crime would be executed in a degrading manner, like crucifixion. If a samurai and a commoner were involved in a dispute, the legal system would invariably favor the samurai. A bow was not a simple greeting. It was a complex calculation of status, respect, and intent. The angle of your spine, the position of your hands, the duration of the gesture, all were messages sent and received. Let us talk about the specific mistake of night crawling or yabai. In some rural communities, there existed an ancient custom where unmarried men could sneak into the homes of unmarried women at night. If the woman accepted him, it could lead to marriage. However, this custom was highly localized and governed by its own strict, unwritten rules. The deadly mistake was to misinterpret this custom or to try it in a community where it was not practiced. The relationship between a samurai and his lord, the daimyo, was the bedrock of the feudal system. This bond of loyalty was expected to be absolute and unquestioning. A samurai's greatest duty was to his lord, superseding even his duty to his own family. The mistake of questioning a lord's order, even if the order seemed foolish or immoral, was a serious breach of loyalty. Use of space within a castle was another reflection of the rigid hierarchy. The central keep, or tenchu, was the lord's private domain. As you moved outward through the castle's various baileys and enclosures, the status of the inhabitants decreased. High-ranking retainers lived in mansions just outside the central keep, while lower-ranking samurai lived further out. Commoners lived in the town that grew up around the castle walls. A mistake would be to be found in a section of the castle where you did not belong. Let's consider the pressures on a daimyo, a great lord himself. He was a ruler of his own domain, but he was also a vassal of the shogun. The shogun's government employed a clever system to keep the daimyo in check, sankin-katai, or alternate attendance. Every daimyo was required to spend every other year living in the capital city of Edo, and their wife and heir had to live in Edo permanently as hostages. The role of the spy, or metsu, was a formal part of the Tokugawa government. These officials were the eyes and ears of the shogunate, tasked with monitoring the activities of everyone from powerful daimyo to minor officials. They investigated rumors of conspiracies, monitored for signs of unrest, and reported on any breach of protocol. The deadliest mistake you could make was to say or do something seditious, even in what you thought was a private conversation. You never knew who might be listening. What about intellectual mistakes? During the long peace of the Edo period, the samurai class transitioned from warriors to bureaucrats and scholars. Study of the Chinese classics and Neo-Confucian philosophy was essential for advancement. However, certain ideas were considered dangerous. Rangaku, or Dutch learning, was the study of Western science and technology, which trickled into Japan through the single, restricted Dutch trading post at Dejima. Even in matters of love and marriage, the rules were ironclad. For the samurai class, marriage was not about love. It was a strategic alliance between families. Marriages were arranged by parents or intermediaries, with the goal of improving a family's status or wealth. To fall in love with someone of a lower class, or to attempt to marry for love against your family's wishes, renai, was a disastrous mistake. The way one handled money was a clear indicator of class. Samurai were officially supposed to be contemptuous of money, viewing commerce as beneath them. Their income was in rice, not cash. This often led to them being in debt to the merchant class. A samurai who appeared too skilled at handling money or too interested in business could be seen as having merchant-like qualities, a serious insult to his class identity. The mistake was to forget this performance of aristocratic disdain for finance. Let us touch upon the concept of kegir, or pollution, in a more social sense. Certain places were considered to be outside the bounds of polite society. The licensed pleasure quarters, like the Yashiwara in Edo, were one such place. While frequented by men of all classes, including samurai, they were a world apart. A samurai was supposed to visit discreetly, sometimes even in disguise. The handling of a sword required its own elaborate etiquette. When visiting another's home, a samurai would hand his long sword, the katana, to a servant at the entrance, who would receive it with both hands and place it on a rack with the hilt facing to the left, indicating no hostile intent. The samurai would keep his short sword, the wakizashi, with him as a sidearm. When seated, he would place the wakizashi on the floor to his right, again with the hilt pointing away from the host.